The dust motes dancing in the light of my flashlight aren't just skin cells and carpet fibres. They are the pulverized remains of a history we were never meant to read. I found the first anomaly in a basement archive in Brussels, tucked behind a stack of municipal sewage maps from 1894. It wasn't a map, it wasn't a deed, it was a requisition form for 40,000 tons of red granite destined for a city that, according to the official census of the time, did not yet have a paved road. Ask yourself how a frontier town with a population of 300 souls manages to order, transport, and pay for enough stone to build a cathedral. Ask yourself why the ledger was marked with a stamp that hasn't existed in any recognised heraldry for 5 centuries. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a clerical error. It was a leak. We are told that history is a linear progression from the primitive to the complex, a slow climb from the mud to the stars. But the paperwork tells a different story. It speaks of a global infrastructure that existed before the Great Reset of the 19th century. It speaks of a civilization that understood load distribution and atmospheric energy in ways that make our modern steel and glass boxes look like temporary shelters. Not a lost tribe, not an alien intervention. Something else, a systemic institutional erasure so thorough that it left nothing behind but the impossible buildings and the paper trails they forgot to burn. I call it the Tartarian silence. I stood in that basement and felt the weight of the silence. It is heavy. It is deliberate. You see it in the architecture of every major capital on this planet. The same domed rotundas, the same massive arched windows, the same Greco-Roman flourishes appearing simultaneously in San Francisco, Moscow, Buenos Aires, and Melbourne. We are taught these are colonial revivals. We are told they are neoclassical tributes. But look at the dates. Look at the logistics. In 1850, the world was supposedly a place of horse-drawn carriages and steam-driven saws. Yet, within a 20-year window, these massive megalithic structures appeared across the globe, often in places where the local industry couldn't even produce a standard brick. The paperwork for these builds is always missing, or it is vague, or it is filed under a name that suggests a sudden, miraculous emergence from nothingness. What if the buildings weren't built? What if they were excavated? What if the great exhibitions and world's fairs of the 1800s weren't celebrations of new progress, but the final harvesting of an old world's corpse? They called them temporary structures. They built them out of staff and plaster, they said, and then they burned them down. Every single one. Not for safety, not for space, for erasure. The deeper I dig into the municipal basements, the more the rhythm of the lie becomes clear. Staccato bursts of fanfare and renovation punctuate the records of every major city between 1870 and 1910. Chicago, 1871. Boston, 1872. Seattle, 1889. San Francisco, 1906. Each time the slate is wiped clean. Each time the old world is replaced by a more manageable, more taxable version of itself. But they couldn't burn the foundations. In the sub-basements of the old post offices and courthouses, you can still see the red brick going down deep into the earth, far below the current street level. The windows are half buried, peering into the dirt. They call them light wells. They tell us it was a fashion choice. Ask yourself why a builder would spend the labour and capital to construct ornate, functional windows 6 feet underground. Not for light, not for air, because the ground changed, because the mud came, or the world was buried, and the new inhabitants simply built on top of the ruins. The paperwork I found in Brussels hinted at this levelling. It spoke of reclaiming the lower tiers. It spoke of standardising the horizon. It is a chilling phrase when you realise it means the literal burial of a culture's physical history. In the archives of the Smithsonian, which I accessed through a contact who prefers to remain a ghost, there is a series of shipping manifests from the mid-19th century. They don't list grain or gold, they list architectural salvage, thousands of tons of it. Ornate ironwork, copper domes, and strange wireless resonators that were stripped from buildings in the American West and shipped back east. To where? To whom? The manifests are signed by men whose names are etched into the bronze plaques of our universities, the gatekeepers, the ones who decided what we would remember and what would become myth. They didn't just steal the land, they stole the timeline. They took a sophisticated transcontinental civilization known in the old maps as Tartaria, and they broke it into pieces. They turned its history into folklore and its technology into magic. Not a conquest of arms, not a conquest of ideology, a conquest of the record. When you control the paperwork, you control reality itself. You can turn a gleaming city of marble into a temporary exhibition, and no one will question why it was demolished the moment the gates closed. I travelled to the salt flats of Utah following a lead about a buried rail line that predated the transcontinental expansion. The official narrative says the rail was pushed through the wilderness by hand, a heroic feat of industrial will. But the geological surveys I found tell a different story. They show a pre-existing grade, a levelled path that had been there for centuries, hidden under the silt. Someone had been there before us. Someone had mapped the world and laid the veins of commerce long before the first pioneer ever saw the Rockies. This isn't speculation. It's in the soil density reports. It's in the load-bearing capacity of the ancient trestles. The paperwork doesn't lie, even when the historians do. It shows a world that was unified, connected by a network of energy and trade that we can barely imagine. And then the signal stopped. The record goes dark. A century of silence follows, and then suddenly we are told we are the first to arrive. We are the settlers. What a convenient word. It implies a vacuum. It implies that the grand buildings were just waiting for us to find them. The pattern isn't just local, it is global. I found the same settler narrative in Australia, in South Africa, in the Far East. Every time a massive ornate stone city is discovered by explorers who have barely mastered the shovel. In Sydney, the buildings are identical to those in London. In Vladivostok, they mirror the streets of Paris. The official explanation is the spread of empire, the export of style. But look at the logistics again. To ship the materials and the craftsmen across the oceans in the 1800s would have bankrupted every nation involved. It doesn't make sense. Not economically, not physically. Something else was happening. The empire wasn't spreading, it was inheriting. It was moving into the vacant houses of a predecessor it had helped to destroy. The paperwork for these new builds is always a mess of contradictions. Architects who were 20 years old when they supposedly designed cathedrals. Construction timelines that are physically impossible. Costs that are never accounted for. It is a fairy tale for adults, designed to keep us from looking at the foundations. If you look at the old maps, the ones they keep in the restricted stacks, you see the word Tartaria written across the vast expanse of Northern Asia and North America. It isn't a region, it is an empire. It has its own flag, its own rulers, its own seat in the councils of the world, and then, in the mid-19th century, it vanishes. It is scrubbed from the atlases. It is replaced by unexplored territory, or Russia, or the Great American Desert. How do you lose a continent? How do you erase the largest land empire in human history? You do it through institutional gatekeeping. You do it by rewriting the textbooks and making sure that any mention of the old world is treated as a conspiracy theory. You make the truth sound ridiculous so that no one dares to speak it, but the paperwork remains. The treaties signed with Tartarian princes still exist in the vaults. The trade agreements for free energy devices are still there, if you know which boxes to open. Not lost. Hidden. I spoke with a retired surveyor in Ohio who had spent his career mapping the mounds. He told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that the mounds aren't piles of dirt. They are structures. They are the collapsed and overgrown remains of a concrete-based civilization that predates the Native Americans by thousands of years. He had seen the core samples. He had seen the rebars, not steel, but a high-carbon composite that doesn't rust. He tried to file a report. He tried to submit the data to the state university. They told him his equipment was faulty. They told him to stick to the boundaries. Ask yourself why a university would refuse to look at a physical sample of an unknown material. Not because they don't care, because they already know what it is, because the existence of that material breaks the timeline they are paid to protect. If the past was more advanced than the present, then the narrative of progress is a lie. And if progress is a lie, then the authority of those who claim to lead us is a lie. The unsettling truth is that we are living in a scavenged world. We are like ants crawling over a discarded watch, marvelling at the gears, but having no idea how to wind it. We use the old buildings for our courts and our banks, but we can't replicate their acoustics. We use the old rail lines, but we can't match their speed or efficiency. We have become a civilization of repairmen, patching the holes in a system we didn't build. And the paperwork, the endless, suffocating bureaucracy of the modern age, is the primary tool of our containment. It keeps us busy. It keeps us looking at the small print, while the giants stand right behind us. I found a document in a New York archive that described the decommissioning of the global atmospheric energy grid in 1887. It was signed by the same men who founded the first electric companies. They didn't invent energy. They figured out how to put a meter on it. They took something that was free and universal, and they made it scarce and expensive. That is the true history of the 19th century. Think about the fires. Why did so many cities burn down just as they were reaching their peak? And why were they always rebuilt in a style that was slightly less grand, slightly more utilitarian? It was a managed demolition. It was a way to remove the old tech, the spires that gathered energy, the bells that resonated with the frequency of the earth, and replace them with things that required a fuel source. If you want to control a population, you must first make them dependent. You must cut them off from the free resources of the world and make them pay for the privilege of existing. Tartaria was the last obstacle to that control. It was a civilization that didn't need the banks, it didn't need the oil companies, and so it was liquidated. The paperwork I've gathered is the record of that liquidation. It is the inventory of a stolen world, and as I sit here, surrounded by these forbidden pages, I realise that the investigation doesn't end with a conclusion. It ends with a choice. You can look at the building across the street and see a bank, or you can look at the stone, the arches, the buried windows, and ask yourself, who was really here before us? The silence of the archives is not an empty thing. It is a pressurized vacuum pushing back against the weight of the truth. I began to notice that the more significant a document was, the more likely it was to be misclassified, tucked away in folders labelled with the most mundane titles imaginable. In a municipal building in Philadelphia, I spent 3 weeks digging through boxes labelled Plumbing Variances 1880 to 1890. What I found had nothing to do with pipes. It was a series of panoramic photographs taken from a height that shouldn't have been reachable in 1882. They showed a city that looked less like a growing industrial hub and more like a high-tech circuit board. The spires weren't just decorative, they were capped with complex, multi-layered metal arrays. There were no power lines, no poles, no tangled webs of copper. The city was clean, wireless, and seemingly powered by the very air it occupied. Ask yourself why every photograph of a major city from this era shows empty streets. They call it long exposure times. They tell us the people were moving too fast to be captured by the slow shutters. But look at the shadows. Look at the crispness of the architecture. If the exposure was long enough to blur a crowd into non-existence, the trees would be a gale force smudge. But they are still. The streets are simply empty. It wasn't a technical limitation. It was a state of being. The paperwork suggested a transition period, a time when the old inhabitants had been cleared out, but the new settlers had not yet been moved in. This clearing is the darkest chapter of the narrative. In the back rooms of a London estate, I found a set of ledger books detailing the reassignment of orphans in the late 19th century. We are taught about the orphan trains as a charitable effort to move displaced children to the American West, but the numbers don't add up. Hundreds of thousands of children were being shuffled across the globe, from Europe to America, from America to Australia, not as families, but as a blank slate workforce. They were the new people. They were the ones who would be taught the new history, the ones who would look at the grand Tartarian ruins and believe they were being built for them. The paperwork for their transit was clinical, heartless. They were listed alongside crates of machinery and livestock, not as humans, as assets. If you want to overwrite a civilization, you don't just kill the adults. You take the children and give them a story that begins with a blank page. You tell them they are pioneers. You tell them they are the first. And because they have no one to tell them otherwise, they believe it. They spend their lives repairing the grand stone buildings they were told their fathers built, never questioning why the doorknobs are too high or why the ceilings are 30 feet tall. The technology of the Tartarian era was not based on the internal combustion of prehistoric fuels. It was based on resonance. In a private collection in Switzerland, I was granted access to the journals of a disgraced physicist who had been obsessed with the great bells of the 1800s. We think of church bells as instruments of religion, but the paperwork suggests they were components of a global energy grid. They were tuned to specific frequencies, 432 hertz, the heartbeat of the natural world. They didn't just ring, they stabilized. They acted as massive tuning forks for the atmosphere, providing a form of wireless power that kept the lights burning and the air clean. And then one by one, they were removed. They were melted down for the war effort. They were silenced. The official records say it was about the metal, but the journals tell a different story. It was about the frequency. If you can change the vibration of a city, you can change the temperament of its people. You can turn a thriving, resonant society into a dissonant, anxious mass. Not an evolution, a downgrade. I followed the trail of the missing bells to the basement of a decommissioned foundry in the Ruhr Valley. There, in a crate that had been unopened since 1914, I found a brass plate etched with a schematic that looked more like a motherboard than a musical instrument. It described the atmospheric extraction of electricity. It was signed with a seal that mirrored the one I saw in Brussels, the mark of the empire that no longer exists. The instructions were clear. The bells were to be replaced by isolated conduits. This is the moment the paperwork proves the crime. They intentionally dismantled a free, renewable energy system and replaced it with a system of wires and meters. They shackled the world to the coal mine and the oil well, and they did it under the guise of modernization. What if the Industrial Revolution wasn't a leap forward, but a strategic retreat into a controlled, inferior technology? What if our progress is actually the slow, deliberate strangulation of a more advanced past? Consider the star forts. Across every continent, from the coast of Florida to the heart of Russia, there are thousands of massive geometric earthworks and stone fortifications in the shape of complex stars. The textbooks call them Trace Italienne or Bastion forts, designed to withstand cannon fire. But look at the symmetry. Look at the fractal complexity. Many of them were built in locations with no strategic value, far from any possible invasion route. The paperwork for their construction is almost always absent or clearly backdated. When I examined the soil samples from a star fort in the Netherlands, I found trace amounts of superconducting minerals. These weren't forts, they were nodes. They were part of a global energy relay system, positioned at the intersection of the Earth's magnetic ley lines. They weren't meant to keep people out, they were meant to bring energy in. But the historians turned them into military relics. They gave us a story of war to hide a reality of abundance. It is easier to explain a fortress than a power plant you no longer know how to operate. Institutional erasure requires a specific kind of architect, the academic janitor. I found evidence of this in a series of letters exchanged between prominent historians in the 1920s. They were discussing the standardization of the North American narrative. They spoke of the need to simplify the origin of the ruins found in the Ohio Valley and the American Southwest. They agreed that any evidence of a sophisticated pre-colonial civilization should be categorized as anomalous and kept out of the general curriculum, not because the evidence was weak, because it was too strong. It threatened the foundation of the newly established American dream. If the land wasn't a wilderness, then the conquest wasn't a triumph. It was a robbery. The paperwork shows a deliberate effort to bury the truth under a mountain of specialized jargon and departmental silos. They separated the archaeology from the geology, the history from the physics, so that no one would ever be able to see the pattern. In the archives of the Vatican, which I accessed through a series of increasingly dangerous digital backdoors, there is a map of the world dated 1650. It doesn't look like our maps. The coastlines are different, the mountains are different, and spanning the entire northern hemisphere is the word Grand Tartaria. It is shown as a unified landmass with cities, ports, and a sophisticated network of canals. But more importantly, the map shows the North Pole as a habitable, mountainous region with 4 distinct landmasses. We are taught the pole is a shifting sheet of ice, but the old paperwork, the sailors' logs, and the early cartographers all spoke of a central mountain and a land that was always green. Why the discrepancy? Not climate change. Data suppression. The pole was the heart of the old world's energy system, the Mount Meru of ancient texts. It was the source of the magnetic power that the star forts and the bells were designed to harvest. When the system was sabotaged, the climate shifted. The pole froze. The history was rewritten to make it seem as though it had always been a wasteland. The Great Reset wasn't a single event. It was a series of planned, Catastrophes. I found a ledger in the basement of a bank in Venice that listed investments in reconstruction across 3 continents between 1840 and 1890. The sums were astronomical, far exceeding the wealth of the nations involved. It was a global mortgage. The new empires were buying the ruins of the old world with money they had created out of thin air. They were literally financing the destruction and the subsequent rebirth of civilization. This is why the paperwork is so convoluted. It is a shell game. One department records the fire, another records the loan, and a third records the new construction. By the time the dust settles, the original owners are gone, the history is rewritten, and the people are in debt to the very men who destroyed their past. Not a conspiracy. A business model. In a hidden room beneath a library in Alexandria, I found the final piece of the puzzle, a collection of blueprints for what can only be described as re-education centres. They were built in the late 1800s, often disguised as asylums or schools for the wayward. The paperwork described their purpose as the purging of ancestral memory. They were designed to take the survivors of the old world, the ones who still remembered the free energy, the bells, and the unified empire, and rehabilitate them until they accepted the new narrative. Those who couldn't be rehabilitated were simply erased. The records show a spike in unexplained disappearances during this period. Not a crime of passion, a crime of policy. The new world required a clean slate, and they were willing to kill as many people as necessary to get it. I am looking at a photograph now. It was taken in 1890 in the middle of a desert that shouldn't have had a city for another 50 years. In the background, there is a massive, ornate building with a copper dome and a series of wireless antennas. In the foreground, there is a man in a top hat holding a shovel. He looks confused. He looks like he just stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to see. I know that look. I see it every time I look in the mirror. We are the inheritors of a ghost empire. We are walking through the rooms of a mansion we've been told is a shack, and the paperwork, the beautiful, damning paperwork, is the only thing that can lead us back to the truth. But the truth is not a comfort, it is a burden. It forces you to realize that everything you know is a shadow cast by a light that was extinguished a century ago. And once you see the shadow, you can never go back to believing in the wall. The loop remains open. The question is no longer what if. The question is what now. Ask yourself, if the past was stolen, what does that make the future? Not a destination, a recovery mission. I am still digging. The dust is still dancing, and the silence is getting louder. The dampness of the lower levels in the New York Public Library's off-site storage facility has a specific scent, the smell of decaying glue and forgotten truth. It was here, amidst a stack of uncatalogued shipping manifests from the 1880s, that I found the first physical evidence of the Great Mud. We are taught that the raised streets of Chicago and Seattle were a simple engineering response to drainage issues. We are told the citizens simply decided collectively to lift their entire cities by 10 feet to escape the muck. Ask yourself the logistics of such a feat in an era of hand-cranked jacks and timber. The paperwork I uncovered tells a darker story. These were not municipal improvements. They were excavations. The lower levels described in these manifests were not new constructions, but pre-existing floors that had been inundated by a sudden global influx of sediment. Not a slow accumulation, a catastrophe. The manifests list the removal of fine silt of unknown origin by the millions of tons. They weren't building up, they were digging out. And as they dug, they found the architecture of the previous world already there, perfectly preserved, its windows peering into the dark earth. It wasn't a choice to raise the streets. It was a desperate attempt to hide the fact that the world had been buried. The institutional response to this event was not one of rescue, but of rebranding. In the archives of the Royal Geographical Society, I found a series of instructional circulars sent to colonial governors in 1878. The language was chillingly precise. It commanded the immediate classification of all unearthed masonry as Victorian or colonial. It ordered the removal of all non-standard ornamental flourishes and the filling of subterranean apertures. This is the point of erasure. They weren't just clearing the mud, they were clearing the record. If a building had a dome that resonated with atmospheric energy, the dome was removed and replaced with a flat roof. If a facade featured Tartarian iconography, it was chiselled away under the guise of modernisation. The paperwork reveals a systematic global effort to strip the old world of its identity. They turned power plants into post offices. They turned energy nodes into courthouses. Not an evolution of style, a castration of function. The financial records of the period are a labyrinth of redirected capital. I spent months tracing the funding of the great transcontinental railroads. The official narrative says they were funded by private investors and government land grants, but the ledgers in the basement of a defunct London merchant bank show a different source: salvage credit. Huge sums were being paid out for the recovery of buried infrastructure. They weren't laying new tracks across a wilderness. They were uncovering an existing rail network that had been laid by the Tartarian civilization centuries prior. The Golden Spike wasn't the completion of a new project. It was the final connection of a stolen one. The paperwork lists the refurbishment of thousands of miles of iron rail that had been found under 6 feet of silt. Ask yourself why the rail gauges of the world are so inconsistent, not because of regional preference, because they were trying to piece together a shattered puzzle and the pieces didn't always fit. I found a photograph in a private collection in Moscow that the state tried to delete in 1924. It shows the Kremlin during a restoration project, but there are no bricks being laid. Instead, workers are using high-pressure steam hoses to blast away layers of calcified mud from a structure that looks less like a fortress and more like a particle accelerator. The spires are tipped with what appear to be massive crystals, and the walls are etched with silver circuitry. The paperwork accompanying the photo describes the silencing of the stones. It explains that the buildings were vocal until the mud came, that they emitted a low frequency hum that provided heat and light to the city. After the event, the stones went silent. The new masters didn't know how to restart them, so they painted them white, called them historical monuments, and told us they were built by Ivan the Terrible. Not a heritage, a tomb. The erasure extends to the very air we breathe. In the National Archives of France, I discovered a cache of meteorological reports from the 1890s that were marked for destruction. They detailed a change in atmospheric conductivity following the Great Reset. Before the 1870s, the air was more ionized, more capable of carrying a charge. This is why the old buildings had those massive metal antennas and copper domes. They weren't for decoration. They were harvesting the ambient electricity of the ionosphere. But the paperwork shows that something happened, a deliberate seeding of the atmosphere or a shift in the Earth's magnetic core that made this form of energy extraction impossible. The Industrial Revolution was the pivot. Once the free energy was gone, they had to give us a substitute. They gave us coal. They gave us oil. They gave us a leash, not a breakthrough, a downgrade to a controllable medium. Consider the mental health acts of the late 19th century. In every major nation, there was a sudden massive increase in the construction of asylums. These were often the most grand Tartarian-style buildings in the region. The paperwork for these institutions is horrifying, and it lists the commitments of thousands of individuals whose only crime was persistent delusions regarding the old order. These were the people who remembered the world before the mud. They were the ones who saw the excavators and knew they weren't building. They were the ones who spoke of the bells and the wireless lights. They were labelled Inte and locked away in the very buildings they tried to explain. It was a psychological purge. The asylums weren't hospitals. They were warehouses for the truth-tellers. By 1910, an entire generation of memory had been institutionalized and silenced. The great world's fairs were the final stage of the deception. I found the budget sheets for the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the White City. The official story says it was built in 2 years by a small army of workers using temporary materials, but the payroll doesn't list enough craftsmen to build a single one of those massive palaces, let alone an entire city. The temporary materials were a lie, a cover story to justify why these magnificent structures had to be demolished after the fair ended. The paperwork for the demolition contractors shows that they struggled to tear the buildings down. They weren't made of plaster and wood. They were made of precast stone and reinforced metal. They weren't new. They were the excavated remains of the Tartarian capital that had once stood on that site. They opened them to the public for one summer to show what the new world could be. Then they blew them up to ensure no one would ever know what it was. In the sub-basement of a library in Kyoto, I found a map of the global ley line network dated 1845. It showed the world connected not by borders, but by energy. Every star fort, every cathedral, every pyramid was a node in a single planetary machine. The paperwork described the maintenance of the resonance as the primary duty of the global government. But then the maps change. The 1860 version shows fractures. The 1880 version shows voids. The network was being systematically dismantled. The star forts were being decommissioned or converted into prisons. The cathedrals were being stripped of their copper. The world was being unplugged. Not a natural decay, a tactical shutdown. The paperwork shows that the men who oversaw this were the same men who founded the first central banks. They knew that a world with free energy is a world that cannot be ruled by debt. I'm looking at a ledger from a shipping company in San Francisco, dated 1907, a year after the Great Earthquake. It lists the disposal of thousands of tons of anomalous machinery found in the ruins. These weren't parts of steam engines or printing presses. They were described as glass tubes filled with mercury and large copper coils with no visible power source. They were loaded onto barges and dumped into the deepest part of the Pacific. The paperwork is signed by an agent of the Department of Antiquities, a department that officially did not exist at the time. They were scrubbing the crime scene. The earthquake provided the perfect cover to remove the last vestiges of Tartarian tech from the west coast. Not a disaster, an opportunity for a final cleanup. We are told that we live in the most advanced age in human history, but the paperwork I have gathered, the requisition forms for impossible materials, the manifests for stolen energy, the records of the institutionalized witnesses, proves that we are living in a regression. We are the survivors of a managed collapse, wandering through the skeleton of a giant, calling it a new build. The architectural revivals of the 19th century were not an homage to the past, they were a rebranding of a stolen present. The silence of the archives is the silence of a grave. And as I sit here, the weight of these 20,000 pages pressing down on me, I realise that the investigation has reached its limit. The paperwork can only take us so far. The rest is written in the stone, in the buried windows, and in the hollow ring of the silent bells. Ask yourself, if the history they gave you is a lie, what else are they hiding in plain sight? The truth isn't buried in the past, it's buried under your feet. The institutionalized amnesia of the 20th century was not a byproduct of time, but a manufactured result of the grand standardization. In the archives of the International Bureau of Weights and Measures in Sèvres, I found a series of suppressed protocols from the late 1800s. They weren't just calibrating the meter or the kilogram, they were recalibrating the perception of reality. They were harmonizing the architectural records. The paperwork detailed the systematic destruction of blueprints that did not conform to the new Newtonian physics. Anything that suggested a non-combustive energy source, resonance-based lifts, atmospheric lighting, or the everlasting lamps found in the subterranean tiers of Budapest was categorized as spurious and removed from the public record. Not a correction of error, a deletion of possibility. They wanted us to believe that heat required fire and light required wires. They wanted to ensure that the next generation would look at a cathedral spire and see only a religious symbol rather than the atmospheric capacitor it truly was. Ask yourself why the tops of these spires are always made of gold, copper, or silver-plated iron. Not for the glory of a deity, for the conductivity of the ether. The red brick phenomenon is perhaps the most glaring piece of evidence hidden in the open. Throughout the mid-1800s, billions of red bricks appeared across the globe, used to construct everything from factories to insane asylums. We are told these were the product of the new industrial kilns, but the chemistry of these bricks, as detailed in a set of discarded municipal lab reports I found in a Philadelphia basement, is anomalous. They contain high concentrations of iron oxide and a crystalline structure that suggests they were not fired in a kiln, but grown or synthesized through a process involving magnetic resonance. These bricks weren't just building blocks, they were energy resonant materials. When stacked in specific geometric patterns, the patterns we call Victorian or Gothic, they created a passive heating and cooling system. The paperwork for these brickworks often lists frequency adjustments rather than temperature settings. They were building machines, not houses. And when the Great Reset occurred, these buildings were stripped of their copper veins and their nervous systems of mercury-filled glass, leaving behind the empty red brick husks we inhabit today. Not a home, a hollowed-out battery. The Great Library of the United States, the Library of Congress, contains a restricted section known only to those with heritage clearance. Through a contact in the janitorial union, I obtained a list of titles that were moved to this section between 1912 and 1915. These were not works of fiction. They were the Tartarian gazettes, daily records of the world, as it existed before the erasure. They describe a society where travel was silent and instantaneous, where the iron roads moved without engines, and where the sky was filled with luminiferous vessels. The paperwork for the reclassification of these volumes was signed by men who would later go on to found the major motion picture studios. This is the moment where history became entertainment. They took the reality of the old world and sold it back to us as science fiction and fantasy. They made us laugh at the very things our great-grandparents used every day. If you want to hide a truth, you don't bury it in the dirt. You bury it in a movie script. You make it a joke. I followed a lead to the abandoned subway tunnels of London, parts of the network that the public is told never existed. In a bricked-up chamber beneath the British Museum, I found a series of massive cast-iron cylinders. They weren't boilers. They were chronometric anchors. The paperwork attached to them, dated 1862, spoke of synchronizing the local timeline with the global standard. This is the most unsettling revelation of all. The Great Reset wasn't just a physical destruction, it was a temporal one. They reset the clocks, they changed the calendar, they introduced standard time, not for the convenience of the railroads, but to sever our connection to the natural, resonant cycles of the earth. We are literally living on a different beat than the world that came before us. This is why we feel a persistent sense of out-of-timeness, a collective anxiety that we are running out of a resource we cannot name. We are out of sync with the architecture we inhabit. Not a feeling, a frequency mismatch. The paperwork regarding the great fires of the 1800s always includes a section on salvage rights. In the records of the Great Chicago Fire, I found that the rights to the rubble were sold to a single conglomerate before the smoke had even cleared. They weren't interested in the bricks. They were interested in the melted remains of the basements. In many cases, the heat of these fires was reportedly so intense that it turned stone into glass and iron into vapour, temperatures that a simple wood and coal fire cannot achieve. The paperwork for the clean-up operations mentions the use of neutralizing agents and lead-lined containers. These were not fires, they were thermal events. They were targeted demolitions of Tartarian hubs disguised as accidents. They used the chaos of the fire to remove the tech that they couldn't explain or repurpose. What if the ashes they carted away were actually the components of a civilization we are only now beginning to rediscover? The institutional erasure of Tartaria required the creation of a buffer history. This is where the concept of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance comes in. I found a series of internal memos from a prestigious European university in the 1890s discussing the expansion of the medieval timeline. They needed to fill the gap between the fall of Rome and the rise of the modern era. They took the achievements of the Tartarian Empire, the grand cathedrals, the complex star forts, the advanced metallurgy, and they pushed them back hundreds of years into a murky, ill-defined past. They invented a dark age to explain why there was no record of these things being built. They turned a contemporary global civilization into a distant, mythic memory. The paperwork shows a deliberate effort to backdate the construction of every major European landmark, not an inheritance, a forgery. They gave us 1,000 years of knights and peasants to hide 100 years of energy and empire. In the port of Odessa, I found a shipping log from 1881 that listed a cargo of relabeled globes, thousands of them. The instructions were to replace all existing world models in schools and government offices. The new globes had something missing. They were missing the land masses at the poles. They were missing the inland seas of Africa. And they were missing the borders of Tartary. This was the final step of the Great Reset, the mapping of the lie. They gave us a new world to look at, and because it was on a beautiful, spinning orb, we believed it. We stopped looking at the stars to find our way and started looking at the maps they gave us. But the paperwork for the old maps still exists in the private vaults of the shipping magnates. It shows a world that is much larger, much more connected, and much more mysterious than the one we are allowed to see. Not a planet, a plane of stolen potential. I found a ledger in an attic in New Orleans that belonged to a census taker from 1870. It didn't list names, it listed disposition. Next to thousands of entries, it simply said removed or integrated. These were the survivors of the mud, the ones who didn't fit into the new settler narrative. They were being moved to the new industrial zones to work in the factories that would produce the new inferior world. They were stripped of their titles, their histories, and their languages. This is why so many people in the Americas and Australia have lost ancestry. It wasn't lost, it was taken. The paperwork for the re-education of these people is the foundation of our modern school system. We are taught to be workers, not inheritors. We are taught to look at the ruins of our own ancestors and call them the works of the ancients. Not a mystery, a suppressed memory. The final piece of paperwork I uncovered was a declaration of completion dated 1914. It was a simple one-page document signed by a council of names that appear in no history book. It stated that the infrastructure transition was complete. The old world was buried. The new world was metered. The history was standardized. The Great War that followed was not a conflict of nations, but a final burn-off of the remaining Tartarian assets, the last of the great ships, the last of the wireless towers, and the last of the men who knew how to use them. It was the closing of the door. The paperwork for the peace treaties that followed was actually a series of contracts for the management of the new global debt-based system. We have been living in the after for over a century, convinced it is the only. I am standing now in the shadow of a massive stone arch in the centre of a city that shouldn't exist. I am holding a photocopy of a requisition form for a material that hasn't been manufactured in 100 years. The wind is whistling through the decorative holes in the stonework, and I can hear the hum. It's still there. The resonance hasn't fully died. The buildings are still trying to talk to us. The paperwork is just the translation. It tells us that we are not the pinnacle of progress. We are the survivors of a robbery. We are living in the leftovers of a feast we weren't invited to. And the most provocative thought of all is this: if they had to work this hard to bury the past, how much harder are they working to keep us from realizing that the old world tech still works? The power hasn't been cut. We've just been told the switch doesn't exist. Ask yourself, what happens when we find the switch? Not a revolution, a reconnection. The investigation is never over. It is only waiting for you to see the pattern. The institutionalized silence of the botanical records is perhaps the most subtle form of erasure I have encountered. In a damp sub-level of the botanical archives in Kew Gardens, I found a series of species elimination schedules from the 1890s. We are taught that the Victorian era was one of the discovery and classification, an expansion of the known world. But the paperwork shows it was also an era of deliberate extinction. They weren't just cataloguing plants, they were identifying and destroying the atmospheric scrubbers, specific types of giant, high silica vegetation that supposedly interacted with the Tartarian energy grid. These plants, often described in the journals as crystalline flora, were said to purify the air and amplify the resonance of the great bells. Ask yourself why the air in old photographs looks so clear, so sharp, despite the supposed smoke of the coal revolution. Not a trick of the lens, a difference in the atmosphere. The paperwork ordered the systematic removal of these species from every colonial territory and their replacement with standardized ornamental plants that had no functional purpose, not a gardening choice, a biological lobotomy of the planet. This biological scrubbing was mirrored by the great liquidation of the world's libraries. In 1904, a fire at the National Library of Turin destroyed thousands of unique manuscripts. We are told it was a tragic accident, but the shipping manifests I recovered from a local dockyard show that crates of manuscripts on vellum were being moved out of the library in the weeks leading up to the fire. They weren't destroyed, they were relocated. They were moved into the private collections of the burgeoning foundation systems, the tax-exempt entities that would soon come to control the world's scientific research. The paperwork for these transfers shows a specific interest in Tartarian mathematics, a system based on base 12 and vortex geometry rather than our modern linear calculus. Not a forgotten science, a sequestered one. They took the tools of the old world and locked them in vaults, leaving us with a math that can calculate the trajectory of a shell, but cannot explain the frequency of a soul. The investigative trail led me to the Red Cross camps established in the wake of the late 19th century disasters. The official history paints these as the birth of modern humanitarianism, but the internal memos from the 1880s describe a different priority: the sorting of the displaced. They were looking for the keepers, said Fundy, the technicians and engineers of the old Tartarian infrastructure. The paperwork shows that these individuals were not given aid. They were given new identities and moved to closed research facilities in the American Midwest and the Ural Mountains. They were the forced laborers of the new industrial age, tasked with adapting Tartarian tech into a form that could be metered and sold. This is why our modern technology feels so disjointed, so bolted on. It is the product of a kidnapped science, stripped of its original context and repurposed for profit. Not a merde. Innovation, a perversion. In the archives of the French Ministry of War, I found a set of blueprints for sound-dampening obelisks that were installed across Paris in the 1870s. These are the same obelisks we are told were gifts from Egypt or celebrations of empire, but the technical specifications describe them as resonance baffles. They were designed to disrupt the standing wave patterns created by the city's original Tartarian layout. They were literal silencers for the Earth's energy. The paperwork mentions that the unrest of the Paris Commune was exacerbated by the clashing frequencies of the new installations. They were weaponizing the environment against its own inhabitants. Ask yourself why every modern city is filled with glass towers and jagged edges. Not an aesthetic, a disruption. They are breaking the flow of energy to keep us in a state of perpetual low-level agitation. Not a city, a cage. The erasure of Tartaria also required the full standardization of the human form. I found a cache of medical records from the 1890s detailing the remeasurement of the populace. Before this time, the records suggest a much wider variety of human sizes and capabilities, what we might call giants or titans. The old doorways, the massive stairs, the oversized furniture found in abandoned mansions, these weren't for grandeur. They were for people who were physically larger and more robust. The paperwork for the National Health Acts of the period shows a systematic push to normalize the human stature through diet and medical intervention. They wanted a smaller, more uniform worker. They wanted a human that would fit into the new, cramped tenement housing they were building on top of the old ruins, not a natural evolution, a miniaturization. I travelled to the salt mines of Poland, following a rumour of a time capsule left by a Tartarian resistance group. What I found was a chamber lined with a blue, glowing salt that seemed to hum when I approached. In the centre was a single lead box containing a set of glass plates, photographs that had been etched into the material itself. They showed the world as it was during the Great Reset. I saw cities being inundated not by water, but by a thick, flowing mud that seemed to pour from the sky. I saw the great star forts glowing with a protective light, trying to hold back the tide. And I saw the ships, the massive silent vessels, lifting the elite away from the destruction, leaving the rest of us behind to drown or be buried. The paperwork in the box was a warning to the inheritors. It said that the reset is a cycle. It said that when the paperwork becomes too heavy, when the lies become too thick, the cleansing returns. Not a prophecy, a mechanical certainty. The financial records of the 1913 Federal Reserve Act are the final contract of ownership. I found a series of side agreements that were never made public. They listed the collateral for the new global currency. It wasn't gold, it was architectural salvage and subterranean assets. They were literally using the buried Tartarian world as the backing for the new paper money. They were printing debt against the value of a civilization they had stolen. This is why they can never allow us to rediscover the truth. If the collateral is exposed as being common heritage, the entire financial system collapses. They don't just own our labour, they own our history, and they are charging us interest on the theft. Not a bank, a pawn shop for the planet. In a forgotten office in the basement of the United Nations, I found a map labelled Project Blue Horizon. It was dated 1947, but it used the same Tartarian coordinates I had seen in the 1650 Vatican map. It showed the unexplored territories beyond the ice wall of Antarctica. The paperwork described vast temperate lands and intact Tartarian hubs that were still functioning. It explained that the International Geophysical Year of 1957 was actually a mission to establish a permanent perimeter around these lands to prevent the reset population from finding them. We are being kept in a managed zone, a small, depleted corner of a much larger world. Ask yourself why every nation on Earth, even those at war, signed the Antarctic Treaty. Not for the penguins, for the gate. I found a diary of a demolition expert who worked on the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. He wrote about the impossible resistance of the buildings. He said that when they tried to dynamite the Tower of Jewels, the explosions seemed to be absorbed by the stone. He described finding vessels of liquid light inside the walls that continued to glow even after they were smashed. He was ordered to stop writing, and his diary was confiscated by the Bureau of Information. I only found it because his grandson had hidden it in the lining of a trunk. The man died in an asylum 2 years later. His crime? He couldn't stop. Talking about the light that wouldn't die. Not a delusion. A witness. The investigation has led me to a point of no return. I am currently sitting in a room filled with the liquid light the demolition expert described. I found a small, intact resonator in the sub-basement of an old theatre in Detroit. It is a simple glass tube filled with a substance that looks like mercury but glows with a soft violet hue. When I touch it, I can hear the bells. I can see the maps. I can feel the weight of the 20,000 words I have written, and I realise they are just the beginning. The paperwork is the evidence, but the resonator is the key. They didn't destroy everything. They couldn't. The world is still alive beneath the mud. The energy is still there. The only thing missing is the people who know how to wake it up. Ask yourself, are you a worker or are you an inheritor? The loop is closing. The light is getting brighter, and the silence is finally, mercifully breaking. The brevity of this next discovery is its most terrifying attribute. In a locked vault beneath the central bank of Zurich, I found a single sheet of vellum, dated 1902. It was not a treaty or a deed, it was a frequency schedule for the human heartbeat. The paperwork detailed how the transition from the Tartarian resonance to the new alternating current would artificially accelerate the human pulse. Not by much, just enough to induce a permanent, low-level state of survival-based anxiety. Ask yourself why you feel a constant phantom urgency. Not stress, not coffee, not the pace of modern life. It is the grid. They replaced the heartbeat of the earth with the hum of the meter. We are literally being vibrated into exhaustion so that we never have the energy to look up at the spires and remember what we lost. Not a lifestyle, a biological prison.